Hi, Caro here. Just before we start the episode, do you live in a country where biannual clock changes are happening? The end of daylight saving time is hitting Europe pretty soon, and everyone is affected a little differently. Some people enjoy the extra hour of sleep, and others find the shorter days a little more challenging. How do you feel about time change? Does it impact your mood, energy, or daily routine? Or maybe you've got tips on how to adjust to this change. We'd love to hear from you. You can share your experiences with us by sending a little voice recording at our email address, which is in the show notes. Or if you don't feel like you want to send us a voice recording that can be played in the podcast, then you can also write a little note or text either on social media, so on Instagram at the handle @LightO'ClockPodcast, or again, just by sending us an email. I hope your stories can be featured in an upcoming episode. Welcome to Light O'Clock. Today on the podcast, we're attending a special concert. The orchestra performing is famous worldwide, and they're known for their tireless performances. In fact, they play every day. So let's immerse ourselves in this musical journey. Conducting this orchestra is our central circadian clock, sitting in our brains. And the musicians are every single organ and tissues and cells in our bodies, following the directions of the conductor in order to produce a beautiful harmony. But how does this work? And what happens when we break this harmony? I called Dr. Lara Kervezee to find out.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me on this podcast. It's really a pleasure. So my name is Lara Kervezee. I work at the Leiden University Medical Center in the Netherlands. And I'm an assistant professor. And my research of my group focuses on what I call circadian medicine. So how we can use the circadian system to improve health of people and also specifically of patients in the hospital.
Very cool. Thank you for this introduction. And today with you, we want to talk about body clocks. That is right, not just one body clock, but actually all of them, all of the many different body clocks that we have. So previously on the podcast, we have talked about our circadian clock. So this area in the brain that is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and we call it our central circadian clock. But actually, we've also mentioned that we don't just have this one clock, but different clocks. So maybe let's start with this question. Where are these clocks and what are they doing?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So actually in all our cells of the body, we have clocks, or almost all cells actually. So these clocks are in our liver cells, in our muscle cells, in our skin, in our heart, even in our eyes, or so whatever organ you can think of, there are little clocks. Yeah, so our central clock is very important, as you heard, I think, previously in the podcast. Is very important for synchronizing circadian rhythms to the light-dark cycle. And actually many processes in our body show a circadian rhythm. So a rhythm that's approximately 24 hours. And so, for example, our sleep-wake cycle is one example, but also our metabolism or our immune system, also our muscle strength, or in our skin, there are circadian rhythms, so rhythms of approximately 24 hours. And it's actually these peripheral clocks that sort of regulate these rhythms. So that makes sure that these rhythms are there. And also, so basically what the function of is that all these processes in the body happen at the right time of day that they're most needed.
So we have all these clocks in different parts of our bodies, but we've also mentioned before that our central clock gets information about time of day from our eyes. So light information about what time it is. And how do these other clocks receive this information?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting an important question that we also don't know completely the answer to. So what we know is that the central clock sends out different signals to the rest of the body and to the rest of the clocks. So for example, these are neural signals. So the central clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus sends signals to other brain regions to, for example, so to let them know what time of day it is, and for example, to help with hormone secretion at the right time of day. So that's one thing. It also projects to brain areas, for example, related to feeding behavior or to temperature regulation. So this all sends signals to the rest of the body to tell other organs what time of day it is. So for example, hormones, there's one hormone called cortisol, which is released by the adrenal gland, and that's under direct regulation of the circadian clock. So cortisol shows a very clear circadian pattern. So it's high in the morning and it's lower during the night, for example. And cortisol is known to really directly influence a lot of different tissues and thereby also influence the genes actually that are involved in regulating the circadian system. And thereby it influences also the peripheral circadian rhythms.
Right. And so is it a little bit like the circadian clock, the central circadian clock, so the one in our brain in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is telling time of day to all of these other clocks to make sure that everything happens at the same time, or that everything happens at the right time?
Yeah, so maybe one good analogy that's often used in the field is that of a conductor and an orchestra. So the central clock is often sort of seen as the conductor of an orchestra that tells different musicians and different parts of the orchestra to do or what they have to do. So so sort of the central clock sets the pace and instructs different organs. What's the best or the most optimal thing to do now? So for example, for the liver, that might be when we are waking up. We might need some energy to start our daily activities. Our clock knows this. So it tells the liver, for example, to release glucose that it stores. So that's the blood sugar. So that makes sure that we are actually ready for the day and can start to be active. So this is just one of the processes that these peripheral clocks really regulate, and that's coordinated by the central clock.
Right. So it's, let's say, a state of synchrony between all of these clocks that we have in the body and our circadian clock, but also between our circadian clock and the outside light and dark cycle, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. And so, now that we talked about this state of synchrony between all of our body clocks, does it actually ever happen that these clocks are not in synchrony with each other?
Yeah, definitely. So what is good to realize is that the circadian system actually evolved over the past million or even billions of years in a very predictable environment. So what we know, our ancestors until maybe 2 centuries ago sort of rose with the sun, and also when the sun set, they maybe only had a campfire, and that created a very predictable rhythmic environment. So bright days, so very light days and dark nights. And in such an environment, the circadian system is actually very handy because it can anticipate these daily changes in the environment. But in the last, let's say 2 centuries, this has changed because now we have electricity, we have artificial light, and this really interferes with with this regular light-dark cycle. So we can switch on the lights whenever we like, and this can indeed create problems for our circadian system because the environment gives conflicting cues to our system.
So in that case, for example, of being exposed to light at the wrong time of day, would that mean that our central clock is not in synchrony anymore with the outside light and dark cycle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then how does that influence the peripheral clocks?
Yeah, so one thing that happens if we see light at the wrong time of day is that it can push our circadian system a little bit later or a little bit earlier, but the peripheral clocks, they are a little bit slower in adapting. So this then can also create a state of internal desynchrony, so where all the rhythms in the body are not perfectly aligned anymore with the external environment. So this then means also if we, for example, eat at the wrong time of day, our body is less capable of handling or digesting the food than at other times of day because it's just not expecting the food to be there.
Right. So basically, it's not just the central clock can be in desynchrony with the outside light and dark cycle, but also the clocks in the body, they can be in desynchrony between themselves.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so both. So it can indeed be the entire circadian system. So by that, I mean both the central clock and the peripheral clocks can be in desynchrony or misaligned with the environment, or indeed rhythms can be misaligned within the body, and that both can create problems.
Right. And can you give us some examples of situations that people might encounter in which this desynchrony happens?
Yeah, so maybe the most extreme example is night shift work. So that's actually 20% of the workforce in European countries is involved in night shift work. So that's quite a large percentage. And of course, with night shift work, most people are forced to sleep at different times than they would usually do. So they're working during the night and they are awake during the day. So that's a very extreme example where really the circadian system gets light input, for example, or also food intake at times that it's not expecting. But other examples that also occurs, for example, jet lag. So when you travel through different time zones, and there's also something called social jet lag that a lot of people experience that might also result in a state of circadian disruption.
Yeah, I think we mentioned the social clock and the biological clock earlier in the podcast when we talked about chronotype. But maybe, if you could define social jet lag for us, that would be great.
Yeah, so social jet lag is maybe a phenomenon that a lot of listeners will be familiar to. So social jet lag is the concept where people during the weekends will usually sleep in a little bit and also wake up, or so they will wake up a little bit later and also go to bed later, actually following their own natural rhythm. So they're following their own circadian system. And then on Monday, when we wake up and you have to go to work or to your university on time, you have to wake up earlier. So in some people, that might be 2 hours or even 3 or 4 hours earlier. So every weekend and every Monday, you're sort of shifting your sleep-wake cycle, creating a kind of jet lag. So we call that a social jet lag.
Right. So exactly this synchrony between what societal demands are and what your internal preference, biological preference is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And now that we described a little bit what desynchrony is and how it can happen, so between all the different body clocks, but also between our circadian clock and the outside light and dark cycle, for example, with jet lag, maybe we can also talk about what the health consequences of this circadian desynchrony are, or this disruption to our circadian rhythms.
Yeah, so here I think, so what's important is to maybe distinguish between the long-term consequences, but also the acute consequences of circadian disruption. Yeah, so maybe to start with the acute consequences of circadian disruption. This is typically measured in very controlled laboratory studies, for example. So what we can do in the laboratory is we can get healthy research participants into the lab, and we can expose them, for example, to sort of a shift work schedule. So just for a few days, we shift their sleep-wake cycle by, let's say, 10 hours. So we keep them awake during the night and they sleep during the day. And that's what we call a simulated shift work protocol. And then we can measure what happens to different physiological processes in such an environment. So not only their sleep is shifted, but also, for example, their food intake. And what has been observed in those studies is that even after a few days, so for example, after 4 days, you will see that when people consume food during the night, for example, the response to the food is less favorable. So you see, for example, that their blood sugar levels increase more in response to food than when they consume food during normal waking hours, for example.
Right. Yeah. And what about long-term consequences of such a disruption?
Yeah. So on the long term, so the evidence from like in this case comes more from very large epidemiological studies. So this is really studies among hundreds of thousands of people. And what researchers have looked at is, for example, the association, so the relationship between night shift work and health consequences. So, for example, BMI, so body mass index, or cardiovascular outcomes. And what's observed there is that even if you sort of take into account other factors, such as that, for example, night shift workers might be less active or maybe eat less healthy. And still, if you take into account all those factors, then still night shift work is associated with a higher risk of those health consequences. So, for example, a higher risk of cardiovascular problems or a higher risk of having a higher BMI.
Yeah. Is this also related to the fact that not only their circadian rhythms are disrupted, but also maybe they just sleep less?
Yeah, that's also a good point, of course. So it's probably a mix of those.
Yeah, because previously we've talked about how sleep and circadian rhythms kind of go together. So, of course, in shift work, you have different challenges, not just sleeping at different times than you normally would, but also just the amount of sleep might differ compared to what you would naturally have.
Yeah, of course.
So we've talked about these negative health consequences of circadian disruption. I was wondering if you could give us a perspective of where the field is going in terms of understanding how this works really, but also having some interventions for people who are suffering from shift work related circadian disruption. So, for example, this might be doctor, nurses, but also police officers and other people that for their work have to follow this different circadian schedule, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's very important to think about. So I think first of all, so one of the future directions of this field is that we really need to understand like how people differ actually in how they're affected by circadian disruption. This is really something we don't know much about. What we do know is that, of course, like some people are more resilient, for example, to night shift work. They can cope with it better, at least in terms of the short-term consequences. So, for example, the sleep loss and the maybe fatigue you can experience. Some people just cope with it better than others. But why this is and how this works, and if we can predict who's more affected or not, that's really something we need to know. And another part is, of course, the long-term consequences. So as I described, shift work might have metabolic consequences or cardiovascular consequences. And also here we don't know how that impacts different individuals. So who is more at risk and who is less at risk. And that's really something we need to find out. And of course, another very important part is, how can we prevent these effects? So maybe regardless of the individual differences, can we design interventions or other strategies to prevent these negative health consequences from happening? And I think one aspect that deserves a little bit more attention is also the question, do we need so much shift work? So as I said, now 20% of the workforce in European countries is involved in shift work. And of course, some of that we need. I think we all agree that we want the emergency department in a hospital to be open.
Of course.
Of course, but there's also maybe some shift work that's a little bit less necessary. So for example, if I order something online on Amazon, do I really want my delivery to be the next day, or meaning that someone will have to be working at night in order for my delivery to be there on time? Or can it also wait maybe a couple of days if that means that a person doesn't have to work at night?
Yeah, I guess that's a really good point of actually one quote unquote easy intervention would just be having less. But for those individuals who have to work shift works, like you said, people working in the emergency room, is there anything else right now that could already help them in terms of things that could help them to cope with these disrupted circadian rhythms?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things, and it's also something that's really being researched very actively. So across different universities. So I think at this point, one thing that people can do is, I think creating awareness is already something that's important. So a lot of times when people start doing night shifts, it's something they do, and a lot of people just sort of start doing it, but don't maybe realize the impact it has on them. And I think that with simple things like thinking like, when do I sleep best? Is it after my night shift, or maybe is it better for me to have a nap also before a night shift to get a little bit more sleep? Another thing that people could take into account is when they eat or what they eat. So for example, when doing night shifts, it can be quite hard to get healthy food because maybe the restaurant at the workplace is closed. So there's only the candy bar machine that's available. So if you don't bring anything from home, then that's the only option you have. So that's something maybe to also proactively think about. Can I like bring some healthy food? Can I maybe, when do I sleep best, during my night or after, before, or during my night shifts?
Yeah, for sure. Researchers, as you said, are actively trying to understand what to tell night shift workers, right? Or shift workers in general. So when should they eat? When should they receive light? Should they sleep before or after the shift? And definitely, as you said, we need to raise awareness. But also, I guess we also need to, as researchers, provide some guidelines of how they could cope with these challenges.
Yeah. So for example, one research project that I did myself was in a group of night shift workers, and there we investigated the relationship between chronotypes, so whether someone is has more morning preferences or more evening preferences, and how they slept during night shifts. So it was an observational study. So we just looked at in a group of approximately 80 night shift workers, so police officers involved in night shift work, how do they sort of distribute their sleep over the 24 hours? And what we saw there is quite a big effect of whether someone is a morning person or an evening person on how they slept. So for example, what maybe you might expect is that very, very early morning shifts, people that have more morning preferences find it or can sleep longer during those type of shifts. Whereas evening people who go to bed later also sleep shorter before morning shifts. And what we also saw is that some people take naps very strategically, so to help them at least sleep a little bit more. So they might still get the circadian disruption, but at least so that's another strategy that people can use is napping, is what we found in that study.
Right. So also you're saying your chronotype can influence how you adapt to the shift work, and how maybe like napping or sleeping can help you differently to adapt based on your chronotype, right?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe as a very personal example is, so for my research, I also at some points needed to do quite a bit of night shifts. Not so many as someone that's really in the emergency department or something, but it happened a couple of times. And what so helps for me as a very relatively extreme morning person is that I can sleep for example, if my night shift starts at 10:30, I can have quite a long nap. So from 7 p.m. until 10 p.m. I can sleep. And an evening person would never be able to do that, or not so easily as I can. So I can get like 3 hours of sleep before a night shift, and then maybe 4 hours after my night shift. Whereas for an evening person, it might be easier to just sleep longer after a night shift.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks for sharing this personal anecdote. Of course, as chronobiologists, we also have to, studying night shift or shift work, we also have to go through it in one way or the other, right? When we're carrying out these experiments.
Yeah, always, I think. Or it's almost impossible to work in chronobiology without ever doing night shifts, I think.
Yeah, if you're doing lab studies, for sure. Yeah, but this also kind of goes back to something we were mentioning earlier, that everyone has different ways of coping with shift work, and we also need to understand what works for different people, why different people are more resilient, and what makes them more resilient. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating field of work, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of this in the next few years.
Yeah, me too.
So yeah, Laura, thank you so much for joining us on Light O'Clock and for shedding some light on how the central circadian clock and the peripheral clocks work, and also what happens when we have a state of desynchrony between all these body clocks, or also between the environment and our clocks. It was a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much to Laura for joining us on Light O'Clock and explaining to us how the central circadian clock and the peripheral clocks work together. If you're curious to know more about how different peripheral clocks work, different clocks in different parts of the body work, you can check out our show notes. We will have additional resources and also a link to Laura's website, so a website of her research group and the research that she does. As always, you can give us some feedback in the Q&A box on Spotify, or also via our email, which you will find just at the end of the show notes. You can also follow us on X, previously known as Twitter, as Light O'Clock, and Instagram as well, Light O'Clock Podcast, where we have more visual explanations of the content of our episodes in the form of stories, but also posts about updates from the podcast, as well as who is behind the podcast, so the team behind it. The next episode will be coming out in 2 weeks, just as always, and we'll be chatting to Professor Danny Smith about mental health and body clocks. Back to you next time. You've been listening to Light O'Clock. This episode was produced by me, Caro Guidolin. Fact-checking was done by Manuel Spitchen. Music, mix and sound design were done by Ingo Bednarek, and sound effects are from Pixabay. Show notes and additional resources were created by Maidel Fernandez Alonso. Our social media team includes Hanna-Sophie Heinrichs, Nilüfer Tabande, and Zara Alkaf. Lucian Bickerstaff helps with the distribution, and Anna Magdalena Billa is our test listener. Light O'Clock is a podcast produced by the Translational Sensory and Circadian Neuroscience Unit, and we are supported by the Circadian Mental Health Network, the Viscom Prize from the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychologie and the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Psychophysiologie und ihre Anwendung, the Max Planck Society and the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, and the Technical University of Munich.